good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another one of our wonderful Brown Bag Lecture Series here at the Kearney Public Library. I'm the organizer for these events, Dr. Nathan Tye, here at the University of Nebraska at Kearney, and we're very excited to continue our long-standing partnership with the Kearney Public Library. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we begin our talk today. We have swag and other fun stuff on the table as usual. If you have any questions or if you want any stickers or buttons or things to take home with you, please do take them from us. We have a couple of upcoming talks. There are flyers for next month's talk on October 9th, which will be myself, and it'll be Death and Dying in Buffalo County, a very morbid topic for October. Yes, we're going from the threat of nuclear annihilation to death and dying. So we're having a real positive. And then on November 13th, we'll be having Dr. Linda Van Ingen discussing the history of women in politics in Nebraska, a timely topic as it is election season. Her presentation, Are Women New to Politics? Nebraska Women is a case study. We'll discuss their ongoing research into early women's political activism and political involvement here in the state of Nebraska. So we're very excited. Continue to stay in touch. Follow us. We're on all the requisite social media sites, and look for other events on our online calendar, the university calendar, the Kearney Hub, and other places where you find your information about cultural programming here in the city. Now, our talk today, Conservation, Civil Defense, Natural Disasters, and Agriculture on the Cold War Great Plains, is brought to us by Dr. David Vail, a recently upgraded professor here at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. He specializes in environmental and agricultural history, the history of science and medicine, the Great Plains, and public history. His research has appeared in numerous academic journals, and he's the author of 3 books, which are actually available downstairs if you're interested in reading his outstanding scholarship. There are copies here. He finds most of his joy in the classroom, which we can attest. He's a very popular educator on campus, and advisor and mentor, talking to local groups and radio stations about local history and mountain biking across the Great Plains, which has resulted in a great many visits to emergency rooms.
Wait, am I not that great, or?
So his talk today, which we're very excited, is for his forthcoming book project, which is under contract from the University of Nebraska Press, Vulnerable Harvests, Energy Conservation in the Cold War Great Plains. Without further ado and further humiliation.
I'm going to try to turn on the mic. It's not going well. Is there a button that I'm missing? The batteries count.
Sometimes the roadies don't get it right.
It's like, I really hope my students don't see me like, I can't turn the computer on. It's like, it's a button every time. All right, can you hear me?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I like to start these things with thank yous and end my talks with thank yous. So I wanted to start by saying thank you to Kearney Public Library. I appreciate the opportunity to speak here with all of you today, but also the kind of community building that you're doing every single day. And I would also say thank you to the Department of History at UNK. Their support of my research and my teaching is a really important piece of my professional and personal life, and I wanted to say thank you to them. And also to the College of Arts and Sciences. And I wanted to do this because he already tried to embarrass me once or twice. I want to also give another round of applause for Dr. Nathan Tye. These are really important talks and really important opportunities to build in community, not just in terms of ideas, but have a sense of community, which I've been thinking a lot about as I've been researching civil defense in the Great Plains, and thinking about it in sort of an everyday kind of way, and not just the missile silos and the fallout shelters kinds of way. I also enjoy that part of the history, Some of my academic colleagues in other parts of the country think it's a little weird that I really like that part of civil defense. And we'll get into that a little bit. But if you're here for the missile silos and the fallout shelters, I might disappoint you a little bit, because we're going to talk about other aspects of civil defense that I think play a fundamental role in how we understand natural disasters and risks in not just in Kearney or in Nebraska, but also in the region itself, and how this region has become a really central place throughout the Cold War, I would argue still, and how we understand these things, not just in terms of the region or the state level, but federal policy. And we'll get into some of those relationships in a little bit. I also would be remiss, I've been thinking a lot today about the attacks in 2001 and the loss of life there, but also the heroic communities that tried to rescue. And I wanted to just make mention of that. It's a really important history that civil defense informs. And so that day will always sort of live with all of us, but I wanted to also take a moment and acknowledge that. Okay, so I've lived in the Great Plains now for 18 years, and one of the complaints I have is that I never learned how to grow mountains properly, because mountain biking. That's sort of, we lived in Kansas first, and then 8 years here in Kearney now. And I've really been struck by two central things. There are a lot of aspects that we can find valuable in the place in which we live. But two things have really struck me over the years. And one is the value of community, which Kearney Public Library supports, our department supports. All of you, thank you for supporting that idea. It's really powerful, for me at least. But also we live in a place of risks. And we get used to that. And there are a lot of reasons why, and we have a really distinct history about risks and hazards in the Great Plains that rural parts of our past really inform, are really important. And it has direct relationship to civil defense. Again, it's really easy, I think, for those of us who like all of civil defense history, we're okay with this, but a lot of people, I think, tend to look at civil defense as kind of the weirder parts of the early Cold War, especially, right? One of my favorites, we'll get into this, but like the Nebrasket, like a soda cracker that's supposed to save you. I mean, Twinkies are probably better, but to eat if we had to choose. But like those are kind of the weirder parts of this civil defense issue, which I think is interesting, but a lot of people might think are weird. But we have more normal context here that is also important that we need to think through, and the role rural places play in that history. So part of this is the emergency conservation history of, as a main topic of my new book that I'm working with University of Nebraska Press with, and I'm thankful that I can share some of that updated research with you. But civil defense helped me better understand a form of conservation in our region and in Nebraska that doesn't exist in the same way as other places. It's easy to think of conservation as sort of this epic debate between how you use the land and how you preserve it. But there's a third way that I'm finding, which is how you protect it. And that means it looks differently than in those larger, more familiar sort of debates around what conservation is and what policies should be and all of that. And civil defense history helps us understand why it's different here. So one of the main questions is sort of like, how does civil defense play a role, the history of it, in all of its forms, but especially this third wave kind of form? Like, what role did it play in an everyday context? Again, it's easy to kind of overlook it as this like weird moment in Cold War history that typically played a role in some of the urban places, but a lot of the rural places in those decades. But I'm interested in the everyday version. And the everyday version has a lot of contributions to how we understand natural disasters today. So I think in that way it matters a lot. Our region also becomes, by like the 1960s, especially a template for federal and state officials in terms of natural disaster policy and response. So before FEMA, which was established in the Carter administration formally, there are earlier vestiges of federal disaster response, and a lot of that sort of those approaches, not just in policy, but in sort of the action part, can track its heritage back to the Great Plains from the 1940s through the 50s and early 60s. So in that way, it matters a lot too. But there's a larger question, a couple of questions that I've been thinking about too for my larger work, which is that, what does conservation look like when risks never really, go away? Well, obviously it's going to look differently, right? How people think about natural resources, how they think about disasters when risks are always sort of around with us. They're going to think differently, and they're going to look at communities differently, and they're going to see relationships differently, not just locally, but between state and federal relationships as well. The other thing is that, I got into this is probably something you shouldn't do very often, but I got into this pretty intense debate with some rural sociologists one time. And they were trying to tell me that people in the Great Plains, producers in particular, ranchers and farmers more specifically, they're very risk adverse and they had no sense of the risk and the hazards of the land or the region. And I just, listened for a while because that's what you do to be polite. But then I also said, I think the history disagrees with you. It's more precise and more honest, perhaps, to say that we acclimate to the risks. We get used to drought. We get used to floods. We get used to soil erosion. So it's always sort of, especially if you talk to producer friends of mine, that's always kind of on their mind, even if it's happening or not. So they're not ignoring it or something like that. They're acclimating to it. And so I'm curious about why that is, how we live with risks on sort of an everyday level, and how people did in the past. We get used to them because we have science and technologies that make us feel like it's true, that we're safer. And so that's part of what I'm curious about in this talk today, but also my larger work. And then another part to this conservation idea around civil defense and natural resources and guarding against disasters like floods or drought is that environment has an interesting role in this third version. On one hand, it's something to protect. Maybe a different perspective about what protection means if you talk to a producer versus a political activist. But there is a common ground about protection there. So there's that piece, but there's also another piece, protecting the land from other environmental risks or threats. So environment is sort of to be protected, but also to be protected from. And that's an important distinction, I think, in this model. So what does civil defense look like in World War II? That's really what I would argue is when it becomes sort of a formalized effort on the home front during the Second World War. And so it's easy on one hand to kind of see it transition into an apocalyptic guarding in the Cold War, right? The fears of the Cold War, and in particular nuclear holocaust and the ongoing increasing tensions and unsettling relationships between the United States and the Soviet Union, it makes sense that civil defense would be sort of this hallmark moment in those years. And it starts, so I like to say to students and to others that this is sort of like the normal expected version of civil defense on a home front kind of context. And I'm going to hand some of these documents out. Some of them easier to find, some of them are more rare. You can go through them as you wish. And they're just some of the artifacts that I'm using for our talk today. But for example, during World War II, we see that these different sort of units within a larger federal civil defense effort have all sorts of community and local significance. I mean, it's okay, by the way, to choose your favorite one. Mine is probably the coffee cup one, which is a food rescue unit in civil defense. Not just because of the coffee part, but maybe largely so. But it's nice to help people, and it's a really fascinating sort of look at the home front civil defense network that is being built from it's being implemented on the federal level, but it's being built kind of almost from the ground up, from local up. And to me, that's what is really distinctive about this sort of normal version of it, because it articulates sort of the role communities already playing on the home front. It's easy to kind of put all these things in boxes in the past, to think about this. And it's a really fascinating sort of local story. And we also see sort of emergency rescue networking here on the other document, which is part of this book here that was published in 1942. And so, pretty obvious to most of us who especially grew up in sort of the 60s and 70s, even earlier than that, we see sort of, this is common, right, this idea of local networks for rescue and emergency, which it has its own sort of history and interesting part, but for me, the civil defense piece is really like the normal, local, even expected relationships here matter, but sort of distinctive and important in our story. But then we have the weirder ones, right? So like, for example, when I look at some of these USDA and federal documents about survival under atomic attack, I'm thinking most of us are going to be wiped out. You know, kind of what is the point? The Nebrasket is also interesting. Again, if I had to choose, I would choose a Twinkie and not a soda cracker, but that's fine. And then most of us probably remember, I was obviously, I'm too young to see this without it being historical footage, but my point is sort of Bert and Duck and Cover, Bert the Turtle and Duck and Cover. Again, like, you think like children are preparing for this atomic attack from the Soviet Union, wonder, it's hard to understand how an atomic attack, how you would survive that by ducking and cover underneath your desk. But that's what happened, right? So this is sort of a way of bringing in community and preparation for a most horrific conclusion. And that is just not really gonna really save you, but it kind of gives you a sense that you could be safe. That's one interpretation of that. And then you have other weird sort of artifacts like handheld Geiger counters, which I think are cool, but other people think is a little weird, that I think that's cool. To, I guess, like, to confirm that, in fact, you are in a radiated space. And my favorite weird artifact, and I don't know if anyone in the room ever saw one of these, but there used to be the Federal Civil Defense Agency used to publish their own kind of like magazine. I think had 3 issues a year. And they had sort of stories from kind of civil defense front in different parts of the country, but they also had advertisements for different vehicles and handheld tools, all sort of civil defense yellow. Pretty cool now to find on eBay, but don't get me started, and Nathan, I'll tell you later what I found. But the other thing too is like my favorite here is just this ice cream truck. They were marketing ice cream trucks that could also serve as like a rescue unit for all these different civil defense kind of ways. So that's kind of the weirder part, I think, or at least a lot of people think of the civil defense history, but that seems to be, you know, like everyone seems to have, I talk to you about civil defense history, they seem to have their own fallout shelter story. Most of them sort of leaked when it rained, and they used it sort of as a storm shelter, which is also, we'll get into that, but part of that everyday civil defense history has to do a lot with natural disasters or the risk of them. And that's where I think that matters a lot, this history of conservation in a civil defense kind of context. So the rural part of this history, I think, is one of the most important facets of it. Often, people often keep it sort of at the national level, and they look at urban examples, but I think the rural history is a really important piece to this. Rural places in civil defense eras were looked at, and we'll get into this a little more when we talk about Nebraska in a second, but they kind of get into this sort of place of to protect, but also a place to sacrifice, which is an interesting tension, right? Like the nuclear terminology in the civil defense era would be sort of counter-force targets, right? These rural places that had missile silos or cities with sort of possible military installations, like off at Air Force Base, for example, to respond to a Soviet attack. Those would be sort of the first places that would be annihilated if atomic war did come. And so there's this constant tension between how to understand sort of a protection idea of farms and rural places for the food supply and other things in communities, and also how to prepare for these zones to be sacrifice zones if necessary. Now, there's an interesting, going around, there's an interesting statement in the opening paragraphs of this fallout from nuclear attack document, and this is basically reprinted many times. The USDA reprinted, so like there were versions that were in the 50s that were basically the same, sort of updated, right? And it's really fascinating because they sort of anticipated that readers throughout the country, but especially in rural places, would be thinking, well, okay, hold on, we have domestic nuclear testing. So, like, what about that fallout? And in the opening paragraphs here, it says, the threat of Soviet fallout, that's the danger. Don't worry about the domestic fallout. Now, just to give you a sense of what that looked like, this is a fallout map of domestic nuclear testing through the 50s and into the early 60s. This map that Richard Miller did also makes the argument, which is historically true, that the underground testing regime that went on longer than the above ground also had aerial deployment of fallout, of radiation. So think about where a lot of this happened in the country, and then these are the fallout clouds, sort of the span of the radiation fallout through the United States. That's from domestic testing. So for sure, people in rural communities, especially in the Southwest, but you can also see in the Intermountain West and the Great Plains, had concerns about what they were saying, regardless of the politics of all of it. So it's interesting that some of this is sort of like quelling concerns by saying, by encouraging, on one hand, encouraging sort of agricultural and environmental thinking, but on the other hand, don't worry about it because when the USA kind of does it, it's okay, but when the Soviets do it, then it's a huge threat, right? Okay. So what about Nebraska? Nebraska is sort of a really important state in all of this, right? Because for a lot of different reasons, it had sort of everything I've mentioned. It has sort of the agricultural rural place to protect, but it also has these counter-strike zones. So it has missile silos. It has Offutt Air Force Base. Val Peterson, who was governor of Nebraska, ultimately became sort of the main director of federal civil defense under Eisenhower. And the last document you see in the folder going around is one of Val Peterson's main publications for rural places and all of this in civil defense, and he emphasizes more than anything else that there needs to be, civil defense matters on this scale, but it really matters on a local scale, and it matters mainly in how to save rural communities from a variety of natural disasters that can happen all at once or happen over time. So I want to get into some of what that looks like in a second, this kind of everyday civil defense that's different to me than, just preparing for missile silos and getting them ready or possibly ready and kind of that federal level or the ice cream level weird parts of the history. Nebraska, this is also in that packet going around. Nebraska is publishing from the 1950s through the 1960s a whole bunch of different civil defense tracts that are combining agricultural health and environmental health with fallout projections and warnings. And so even in some of this language here, you can really see that they're talking about fallout in terms of survival and preparation, but they're also talking about it in terms of what civil defense can provide with good farm management. And good farm management in this document and others that I've looked at, they're talking about how to keep your lands healthy from a variety of threats, not just Soviet atomic nuclear bombs. You also see kind of an embrace on an everyday civil defense level in terms of preparation and protection ideas around that. Of course, you get the insurance companies in there. And so there's a whole bunch of insurance companies that are establishing what would become kind of crop security insurance, not just in terms of droughts and floods and disease, but they're directly tying themselves to civil defense. Which makes sense if civil defense is pretty prominent in your local town and you want to be a successful crop insurance company, you're going to tie it to anything possible to be successful economically, yes? But to me, that's a really fascinating interplay between like thinking about securing your fields by establishing an insurance that is specific to kind of a civil defense conservation idea. That makes sense more to us now, where from basically the Great Depression on, you see the New Deal doing that with the drought of the 1930s and the dust storms, but this gets sort of emphasized and I would say scaled up with a civil defense context in the Cold War. Another important council that's sort of navigating this, that's adjudicating it at the regional level, so the council sort of is established right in the 1930s to help specifically with the drought and the dust storms, but pretty quickly becomes a council of interest that helps adjudicate all of these issues throughout the 1940s in World War II, throughout the 1950s during one of the worst droughts post-30s in the region, all the way through the 1990s. The council ended in like 1996, I think. So it's a really fascinating role that the council's playing in this. And the Great Plains Agricultural Council consisted of a variety of different interests. You had policymakers that showed up there, you had insurance people that showed up there, you had farmers and ranchers and other sort of we would call producers today that showed up there, and then also a variety of different agricultural scientists. And they all attended each other's panels, they presented on their local knowledge and ideas, and they debated, sometimes pretty intensely, about how to protect the lands from these sort of everyday threats that they saw value in civil defense. And oftentimes they would have civil defense unit commanders and others like come in and present on updates around civil defense. So the purpose here to sort of for connections today is just to see how central a council like this became in terms of how they are understanding the risks, but also how they become sort of central in implementing solutions and responses. So what were some of these committees? Of course, a council like this had to have multiple committees. You often do, I guess. We always have to have meetings about things. And so disaster relief, they're studying plains weather and climate research. I mean, they didn't call it this then, but they're basically trying to understand and guard against what we call today climate change. And this is happening especially in the 1950s in trying to address the 1950s drought. And then soil stabilization, water resources, and ultimately in the 1970s and 80s, pre-farm crisis, they get into sort of this alternative agriculture approach. And all of this is through this lens of conservation protection and conservation civil defense. So what does this everyday conservation civil defense look like? Well, first, the relationship between soil erosion, irrigation, and radioactive fallout. The main point here is that it's very much interconnected. If you read these documents, you see their research and mitigation of soil erosion and worries about that factor into this idea that they have around irrigation defense that starts sort of around civil defense concepts during World War II in rural places, and then sort of scales up to how do we guard against drought and also create a more certainty in production year after year after year in lands that before we had this sort of irrigation network. And this is, by the way, this is sort of like in between the drought of the 1930s and the advent of like pivot irrigation that would really come online in the early 1950s. So it's sort of like evolving into that idea. And so you sort of see here a really famous engineer that grew up in Nebraska but that spent most of his life in Fort Collins, Colorado, established what he saw as a sort of an irrigation landscape for crop security purposes, Ivan Wood. And so part of that is this like idea of controlling where water goes and how to use it, but also it's guarding against soil erosion. You can sort of see in these schematics sort of his vision of what that would look like. And he's very much almost not quite using the word civil defense, but in his writings and in his context, he's speaking in those terms. And so you see a lot of like pre-pivot irrigation approaches for water use is sort of around contour farming. And so that's sort of predates that. But again, like thinking about protecting the land and still using it, but thinking about it in terms of how to protect it, but also how to protect from natural disasters is that tension that we see here. And then how does that all translate to fallout? So what I find fascinating is so much of the Great Plains work and thinking about soil erosion and about irrigation security is filtered in a variety of ways in these publications around fallout of the late 50s and early 60s to mid 60s. And so if you read these and the stuff going around, you can really see that the experience and the knowledge and the experimentation that is happening from the 1930s into the 1950s on like soil erosion and irrigation is also informing how fallout is understood and how it's presented. Again, always never saying that domestic nuclear testing is bad or problematic, always saying that it's from foreign places, especially the Soviet Union, right? So communist radiation, bad. American radiation, not as bad. What about blizzards and tornadoes? Probably for us in this room, this is what we would expect more, right, in terms of an everyday civil defense, and it's true. I pulled out one of the best examples, which is the 1948-1949 blizzard that affected a lot of the northern Great Plains states into the central plains, really Kansas, but in Nebraska in particular. And you see these sort of civil defense networks and ideas about conservation and rescue all kind of mixing into one. And you see that through the variety of collaborations between agricultural scientists and federal rescue units and National Guard units, all trying to save farmers and ranchers in more rural parts of the state and other states in the northern Great Plains. What I find very fascinating too, because of my love of airplanes and aviation history and all of this, is that a lot of the flying farmer communities in the Great Plains helped the federal government out in this rescue effort, like Operation Haylift and Operation Snowbound. These flying farmers, by the way, would ultimately become, or were already, some of the important ag pilots, agricultural spray pilots, that were conducting, in their view, their own sort of civil defense efforts against pests. And that's sort of the last slide today is this sort of view of disease and pests in this civil defense conservation concept too. A really good book on this, by the way, is David W. Mills' book, Operation Snowbound, Life Behind the Blizzards of 1949. It's published by North Dakota State University Press, and it's a really good look, I think, at some of the relationships and the collaborations that we're talking about. Now, interestingly, too, in terms of a civil defense, how this sort of everyday regional connections between civil defense efforts and ideas about conservation, how that's informing on the national level and international level. President Truman is basically going to use a very similar system to do a Berlin airdrop later, about, like 4 or 5 months later. And using almost the same kinds of planes and the same kind of idea here in terms of rescue over the Berlin Wall. And so the point, I guess, is the role that this history plays in understanding not just what's going on in our region, but how it's beginning to increasingly inform sort of a federal view of all of this as well. We're used to tornadoes, and again, I'm not going to go into every single natural disaster that's happened in our state or other states. That we would be here at least a day, which might be might be fun, but definitely probably would be depressing. But the point is that in this effort to create a kind of civil defense protection against tornadoes, one of the worst probably natural disaster risks of our region and of our state, we see that there's a growing effort to think ecologically and environmentally, not just about these storms specifically, but also about what that means in a larger context. And so they're thinking in a conservation context. And so that's another piece, and you can sort of see how blended these sort of civil defense pieces are with these larger efforts to better understand these storms and the sort of environmental conditions around them throughout the 50s and the 60s. Again, this is all predates like formalized FEMA response and that sort of thing. And it's informing where all of that goes at the federal level as well. So the tornado blizzard part is a really important piece of this everyday conservation civil defense, I think. And another book I want to recommend, our friend of the library here, Jim Minnick, has written this really powerful local history of a town in Kansas called Without Warning, the Tornado of Udall, Kansas. And he also talks about this sort of history at that kind of local level, and that was one of the most horrific tornadoes of Kansas's history. So I also recommend that book as well. What about flooding and drought? Also very familiar to us in our state and in our region. The Great Plains Agricultural Council became kind of a key organization to guide local, state, and federal relationships in these efforts. So first, in the early 1950s, you had some of the worst flooding in sort of a generation. And you see that Truman is meeting different folks at different agencies and groups, rescue groups and response groups in Omaha, including members of the council are there as well. And so this is part of this thinking about flooding, right? What brings floods? What do we do to mitigate floods? We have to understand the agricultural impacts of those disasters, but and community impacts of those disasters, but we can't just always be reacting. We have to think more holistically about what flooding means in our region and how to protect against it. Again, it's that tension between we have to protect our lands from flooding, not just for production, but because we care about them in a larger sort of agricultural health kind of way. But that requires us also to protect against the very environment, right, that we're trying to understand and use. So that tension is very much a part of this. As Truman is trying to work with these agencies and groups in the Great Plains to better understand this really bad flood and what to do about it on a regional scale, not just from year to year. And so what he comes up with, which is a very controversial plan for the next almost 2 decades, is what becomes known as the Missouri River Basin Flood Conservation Plan. And as you can see on the right here, the council is very central in almost all aspects of the planning, and less so in the debates, but aspects of the planning at the local, state, and regional levels. So they're directly informing how conservation is understood in this context, and it's a very civil defense orientation in the Truman administration and ultimately into the Eisenhower administration. What I like about on the left here, and both of these newspapers, or this newspaper is from Nebraska, you sort of see how they are thinking about it in terms of all of this, like curbing erosion, providing irrigation, which is a security idea, and electric service, right? And so this conservation plan would move forward, and it would be sort of established in this region through a variety of different installations, flooding installations. They would build new lakes to sort of for hydrology offshoots and irrigation structures. But you can imagine the politics of this not as straightforward. And so a lot of rural communities lost out with this plan. And if you want to know more about that, you'll have to read my book later. So what about drought? Drought is another important sort of natural disaster that's always kind of around us, even if it's not imminent, right? And I mean, every time you listen to KRV, I hear someone somewhere talk about drought or the risk of drought or the worries about that, still even today. So it's still very much a risk that we adapt to. How did this look in the 1950s? Probably a lot of folks then, and historians like me now, all say that that was probably the closest the region really came to another more or less dust bowl. I mean, and people living during the time were really worried that it was another dust bowl. And what's fascinating to me is the council worked directly with the Eisenhower administration. Eisenhower took a fun little tour around the Great Plains. I wouldn't say fun, but an important one, I guess. Maybe that's the better word. But he used the council research, science, and debates to better understand how the droughts of the 50s, 1956, 57, 58 in particular, match or were distinct from the 1930s. So here's Ike, and here's more or less his drought tour route. Now there's one exception. This is an older document. It should have lines that go up to Nebraska and then back down to Kansas to Wichita. They had this, the council held this really significant drought conference at the end of this tour where Eisenhower spoke to Great Plains council members and talked very much about how their work on the science and the debates and the policy pieces of the council's work would directly inform federal drought policy, not just for the region, but maybe for the country. Now, why did he go up to Nebraska? Because of Fred Seaton. Fred Seaton and the Nebraska delegation were, I'll use the polite term, were more than upset that Eisenhower was ignoring Nebraska. And so they were able to convince the administration to make sure they came up here. So actually, it should go up here and then down, and then back to Washington. So some of the studies, you should sort of see the collaboration piece, but you also see how sort of the overlapping pieces of studies and how the Eisenhower administration is very much looking at all of this in a collaborative kind of way. And so a lot of this data comes from council modeling. And again, it's all about thinking about conservation in terms of protection, not just preservation or how best to use natural resources, but it's this third way of protecting that I think is really significant. They also were very curious about precipitation, obviously deficiencies between the 30s and the 50s. And so here's another report that Eisenhower had on his tour. And then this is just a nice document that kind of articulates the importance of the drought conference and all of the different stakeholders that are attending that conference at the end of this tour. And very much thinking about conservation through kind of an emergency kind of protectionist lens. Okay, final slide, and then please ask questions because I'm curious what you think, and I do honestly want to hear your fallout bunker stories if you've got them. But there's another piece, the pest and disease piece, right? They're always sort of around attacking farms and ranch lands throughout the Great Plains. And so another sort of persistent piece of this from the 1940s into, you'd say it's probably still true today, which is that pests, disease, and chemicals become one of the main sort of things to be thinking about as this conservation civil defense scales up throughout the region. How to protect our fields and lands means that we have to use tools and kind of almost weaponry that carries its own risks. So how do we better understand that? And it makes it a really kind of complicated piece of this story where you, more or less, you may have drought and flooding sort of always on the horizon, but it's not as imminent as insects, weeds, and disease for crops in ranch lands. And so That becomes an important piece as well for better understanding how conservation civil defense emerges in our region and then how it persists through. And so I guess my final conclusion is, to me, this work shows a lot of importance in like interdisciplinary history. It gives us a better sense of how agricultural risk and environmental hazards played sort of a significance in this history that we're talking about, sort of a regional history, and the value of looking at regional history. I like the everyday idea here of civil defense. The value of it is much stronger and wider in its aperture, I think, than if you just sort of say, well, I mean, it's weird, it's basically fallout shelters, like soda crackers and missile silos. I think also, personally, that the history of these things shows us the kinds of collaborations that were once possible, the value of community in those collaborations. And I think they will probably need to be rediscovered and expanded upon in decades to come. I mean, for me, like the early Cold War era, our 21st century Great Plains continues to be a central region for these things, an important region. It shows us we have pretty complicated relationships with our food production, and can be pretty conflicted. I think that when we talk about stewardship of the land, this helps us better understand that it requires honesty and it requires all of us. And for all of that, I think this history can help us better understand the risks ahead. So, thank you. All right, questions?
Do you have a farming background?
I do. Well, not really. I've loved agricultural history. Wow, probably most of my life. I grew up in sort of central Oregon, so I'm not from Nebraska originally. I always say to my students, I'm a Nebraskan by choice. And then we talk about how long do I have to live here to become considered a Nebraskan? Is that, so we have those conversations. My great uncle owned a ranch in rural Oregon, and I would visit sometimes, and we would talk. I remember talking with him when I was like in grade school, and he was kind of a gnarly dude, to be honest with you. But and also like spending a lot of time in different environments in Oregon, like the mountains and some of the more ranch land areas of rural Oregon. Like I had a sense of that, but I didn't grow up in agriculture. But I've lived it for a long time. And I also think like it's really important to be a historian where you live and try to better understand the home that you have and the region in which you live. And so I try to do that. Yeah.
I'm really interested in the history of the people who do the spraying. Because still when you're out on the interstate or on the highway,
Yeah.
you see those planes and you think they're going to get you. And you do. And has that sort of been always been the way they've done it since the 40s, 50s? Can you kind of speak to that and the environmental impact?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Pam. I mean, my first book was on the history of agricultural aviation in the Great Plains. I started really from the 1940s, post World War II on. But yeah, I mean, one of the things, so with that work, which does factor into this one, because you have these groups that are aviators, but they're also in agriculture, and so they have to think a lot about agricultural and environmental relationships, way more than like the politics for sure allow for. And so in that book, I kind of get into, I was really interested in like what was going on with the history of agricultural spraying and chemical use, pesticide use in the Great Plains. There had been one other book on the South, which is a distinctively different region in a lot of different ways than where we live. So it's not the same, but a lot of the work that I had been engaging with And that was basically my doctoral dissertation. I got my PhD at Kansas State, so I was working on it there. But the book version basically tries to get at what's going on in the Great Plains as a region, how distinct is it, how similar is it, but more importantly, I guess I thought that at some point the ongoing history and discussions around all of that, to that point I published my work, was a lot about, you know, the politics between agribusiness and environmentalists. And like that has its own relevance for sure, you know, but I thought it left a lot out. Like I was curious about, okay, well, like the people using this stuff, how did they think about it? Were they worried about it? Did they try to establish their own protocols? Did they try to pursue, you know, toxicology? Like, did they understand that in a way that seems to be left out? And it turns out they did. And so, you know, that challenge, it's way more complicated when you get to a local sort of regional level than just like the national politics. It's easy to put people into groups and then say, oh, you'll never get along, you'll never talk to each other, and you're either all good or all bad. That's not giving the scholarship, that's a little unfair to that scholarship, but I was a little frustrated that it seemed like it was coming across that way. So the industry itself has really evolved for both good and, I would argue, ill. Good in the sense of precision and sort of pursuit, especially in sort of the digital age, a precision-based thinking. But that also kind of cuts back onto the industry at the same time because it gives sort of a false confidence. Like the more precise I be, the danger is less. Well, that's not necessarily a correlation that's true. So yeah, when I used to give public talks about that book, I would always not, like everyone, like there would always be two camps in the audience and people were like, well, you're just too anti-agribusiness and so you're, you know, I'm like, okay, well first did you read the book? It's like, well no, and I'm like, well maybe read the book first. And then we can have a dialogue about it for sure. Or like I wasn't environmentalist enough. And I guess somewhere in there I felt like I must be doing something right in there because I'm following the history of it and it's not going to conform to the patterns of your political views necessarily or your ways of understanding what you think that history is. It may not conform to that. And I just need to be honest to the record, and so that's a really long answer.
Did the farmers have a big voice back in the 50s, 60s, or was it pretty much Washington telling them all this stuff?
I think in terms of this history that I'm telling, they had a much louder voice than in other sort of contexts. So like the council, I would say probably the council gave that, like amplified that. I mean, it's amazing to see the transcripts where they're like taking on agricultural scientists and policymakers in the same room, and the council sort of tries to amplify the producer voice in ways that challenges kind of the technocratic view of like, all we need to do, we're from the federal government, we're here to help you. It's much more complicated when you're trying to like address natural disasters, and so you need that local knowledge, and you can see an embrace of that in a way that in other aspects of agricultural history of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, I don't think you see. I mean, it's definitely federal heavy with those. So to me, it's a really fascinating exchange that I read. The council met every single year. They had multiple subcommittee meetings, and all of that is transcribed in collections in Lincoln and in Fort Collins, Colorado. And so tracking that is a really fascinating sort of insight into the extent to which they provide input in a way that maybe you wouldn't see in other realms. Yeah.
Wondering, do you know if the Oglala aquifer, if that ever entered the conversation anywhere, or especially during the drought years, did they ever consider the Oglala aquifer at all? I don't know if that was this at all.
They did. I mean, especially in the 1970s and early 80s, you see a shift in council attitudes and debates more about, okay, well, you know, for a long time they embraced a lot of the stakeholders in these council meetings. They embraced pivot irrigation, other types of similar irrigation technologies as a way of bringing certainty. Now, it's not just pure economic thinking, right? That they're also saying like, this is a way that we can draw from the aquifer, we can bring more security and certainty to farming communities in places where they were decimated in the Great Depression years. But they weren't as concerned with what we would say the ecological risks of those technologies. That would shift, I notice a shift in the primary source material that I'm looking at in this late 70s, especially in the late 70s and early 80s. And the Great Plains has another drought series come through again in those same years, and then they're starting to worry like, well, what if the aquifer actually runs out? Then what? And we're still, I think we're still kind of worried about that today. So the aquifer does play a role, and they're aware of it, but that role in terms of the worrying about the aquifer supply per se is less in the early Cold War years than it is like in the later Cold War into the early 21st century. I saw another hand. Yes?
Well, I'm really interested in the civil defense piece of it.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in how it, like you mentioned, how it plays a part in today, how it's kind of,
Yeah.
Is the civil defense still exist, and how that connects to like our modern day preppers?
I mean, civil defense now is much more sort of established it's established in terms of organizational structures. So you have like very clear cut like Homeland Security and the federal apparatus, and you have more of a state-based apparatus that connects to that. So it's less sort of, I would argue, it's less similar to what we see in these years, and more sort of, if you have, like if a natural disaster hits Kearney, these are the organizations at the state and federal level that you need to correspond with. So it's much more, I would say, formalized, less local, and in the same kind of context. But that being said, some of this, in my opinion at least, some of the same principles persist. And like I remember when we had, I forget when this was, 2009 maybe, I could be off, but like Manhattan, Kansas, when we were living there, had a F5 tornado hit Manhattan. That was one of the scariest moments of my life, because it like tracked like a block and a half away from my house. If it had happened during the daytime, I could have had like a launcher and seen it's like my own Twisters movie. No one died, and there wasn't any sort of property loss was made. It hit basically the university, and so the main property loss there was, but the main property loss was set, like in terms of cost, was centered there. But I remember like, okay, so you have Red Cross and you have National Guard and you have these other sort of formalized entities that are less formal here. You sort of, in these years, you have more of like Red Cross is there and civil defense is there. But I saw, I was part of like just community groups that went out, religious and non-religious, that just went out to help. And I think about that a lot when I'm researching and writing about this, because it's like, even though it's less sort of, we don't have civil defense units like then, I feel like there's a similar kind of connection and collaboration that I experienced when I was just like, tell me where I need to go and I will help. And so I hope that's answering your question, Brett.
Yeah, I was thinking of like the modern day preppers, people that
Yeah.
take their civil kind of into their own hands and
Yeah.
do it. I just didn't know if you've seen any like now present day connection to the civil defense, like taking it to a different level.
Yeah, I guess this is more of a formalized version in terms of like communities helping guard against Soviet attacks, but also like everyday risks and hazards of like natural disasters. I don't get as much of a sense of like sort of the political nature of these units. I would say like the preppers today, there's more of a fear-based political response that a lot of them share, not all of them. But it is interesting, like talking to some of them, they have a really strong sense of this history, and they would say that they probably would feel very sort of in tune and connected to this longer civil defense history for sure. So I don't know, maybe there are some connections, but I think it's distinct to our times too. I think we're out of time, everyone. Thank you for coming and thank you for your questions, and I appreciate it very much. Thank you.